All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Hugo Bernier. My Twitter account is @BernierH. I love to stay involved with people and answer questions on Twitter, so please don't be shy. I'm usually a nice guy, as long as I've had coffee. So today we'll be talking about integrating Microsoft Graph in your solutions using the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Graph Toolkit are two things that many people are not aware of, especially the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which is kind of like a secret weapon that's available to you. So today we will be talking about this. There's a lot of code, a lot of material to cover, so I will be going quickly today, but everything is recorded. I have QR codes for every link in my presentation, and I will make the presentation available. I believe everything will be available on YouTube, so if you just search for failed demo, probably you'll find my demo at the end of this session. All right. You may not know, but the SharePoint Conference is now called the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. The next one is on March 23rd to 25th in Las Vegas, and next year. I will see you there. I want to thank all the generous sponsors for making this event possible. It is awesome. I've been staying online and attending a lot of sessions. I'm doing today's session, and then I'm doing another session later with David Warner about animations. Let me talk to you about myself. That's usually my least favorite slide of all, but my name is Hugo Bernier. I'm broadcasting from Barrie, Ontario, Canada. That's just north of Toronto. I'm an independent consultant. My company is Tahoe Ninjas. I'm the world's laziest developer. So lazy I couldn't even bother to write the word developer completely. So that means I'll try to avoid whatever solutions, whatever extra work I have to do, I'll always try to find kind of the easiest and most efficient solutions out there. I am a Microsoft MVP. I'm also a very proud member of the Microsoft 365 Patterns and Practices team, and I'll tell you about that in a second. Originally, I'm from Quebec City, and my mother tongue is French. So when I get really tired, I start sounding a lot more French. But let's keep going. So the Patterns and Practices team is actually a team of awesome people, except for me maybe, but a bunch of people that are building patterns and practices, so tools and guidance and things like that around Microsoft 365. The whole motto is sharing is caring, and there's tons of initiatives, tons of tools that are available to you, lots of web part samples and extension samples and all sorts of stuff of that. We've created recently a page that you can go to. The QR code is there, but if you go to this page, you'll have access to everything. So you have access to community calls, samples, all sorts of guidance, lots of stuff, and we're constantly updating this. If you go to this bit.ly.url there, there is a raffle. So make sure you submit your answers to enter the raffle, and then hopefully you can win. And if you don't like it, let me know. I'll take your prize. Okay, so we've all been there. You have your boss that says, "Hey, I'm going to need you to go ahead and customize this solution for me. I'm going to need you to go to, copy this stuff that Microsoft 365 has. This, show profile information about someone, or show an agenda, or show something like this." And they're really asking you to rebuild something from scratch and to access information that's available in Microsoft 365. And, often we'll build something that may or may not, look professional. We'll kind of put something together in a do-it-yourself solution where we're rebuilding some of the elements that are available. I know I've done this many, many times where I wanted to reproduce the, that cool user profile information when you mouse over someone's name in Office 365 or SharePoint, or I wanted to show someone's agenda to be able to schedule events or things like that. And usually what we end up doing is the results that we get are not always the results we intended. It's usually something a bit more hacked together and not as stable or as tested as Microsoft would have done it. You know, it makes sense because Microsoft has tons of resources to around queuing and testing the tools. You don't necessarily have that many resources. So that's kind of a problem. And it can be really frustrating to build something yourself, especially something that already exists out there and you just want to tweak it. You just want to customize it a little bit. And that's where the Microsoft Graph Toolkit comes in handy for you, because the Microsoft Graph Toolkit you know, is kind of a series of, or a collection of reusable framework agnostic web components and some helpers as well that you can use to access the Microsoft Graph. The great thing about the Microsoft Graph Toolkit is it's fully functional right out of the box, and you've got providers built in that allows you to authenticate, like log in and get the data from Microsoft Graph. So what is Microsoft Graph? Again, I've been talking about Microsoft Graph, and you may have heard about Microsoft Graph, but you're not quite sure what it means. Well, the Microsoft Graph is really the glue that binds Microsoft 365 together. I'm sorry, this slide is kind of blurry a little bit. I tried to grab official materials from Microsoft, but Microsoft Graph is really kind of the gateway to all the data and the intelligence that you have in Microsoft 365. It really provides you with a unified programmability model, if I could say that word, that you can use to access your data in Microsoft 365 and even in Windows 10 and in your enterprise mobility and security. Now, Microsoft Graph has a lot of functionality. Luckily, Microsoft has created a tool called the Graph Explorer. Well, it's not a tool, it's a website called Microsoft Graph Explorer. The URL is available here. I'll just leave this on the screen for a few seconds in case you want to grab the code, the QR code, and play at home while I'm doing this. But let's visit the Graph Explorer. So the Graph Explorer here is something that, again, it's a website that allows you to kind of explore all the APIs or all the endpoints that are available by Microsoft Graph. And you can see there's a lot there. You can see things like accessing your groups, your insights, your teams, your notes, your OneDrive, like pretty much everything, right? And then for each one of those, you can actually go and select, for example, this one, get my profile. It'll actually tell you what the URL would be for you to call, and you just run the query. Now, I'm not Megan Bowen. This is actually when you start with the Graph Explorer, you start with a test environment, and that's great because I'm usually way too lazy to go in and add sample data in my environment. But if you really want to test it using your own data, you can sign in to the Graph Explorer as yourself. It'll probably ask you to, well, definitely ask you to authorize the Graph Explorer because it'll be accessing some of your data. But this is how you can do things like get your profile information. Let's just see something fun here. Let's see list of people that I work with. So again, it gives you the URL that you can work with. If there's any parameters you need to pass, it'll give you the request here. If you need to specify headers or anything like this, you'll actually it'll show you how to do this here. And then it gives you a response kind of preview of what you're going to be getting. At the same time, you have access to code snippets. So this is great. If you're just trying to quickly write some code in your app, you're writing it in C# or in JavaScript or any of the languages that keep on adding here, you can just kind of go to the code snippet and copy the code and paste it in your environment, and you know, it'll mostly work. Mostly. There are some things that can be a bit more complicated. So for example, if I go to my calendar, let's say if I wanted to get the events for the week, so it's actually showing you here how you would build the query here. And it's you're passing it the start date and end date, you run the query, and then if we look at our response, we're getting lots of events here. Now, this is where it starts getting interesting. So sure, the Graph Explorer makes it easy for me to go in and make a request. They give you the code for you to call the code, the API, and retrieve the results. But then you're on your own, right? You end up with something that looks like a puzzle kind of thing. You've got some JSON that you need to parse, and then you need to format it. So if I wanted to do something like maybe taking information about someone, so this is just a result of a Graph Explorer or Graph API call that's returning information about Annie, and I wanted to show a more persona card, right? Something that is more consistent with the user experience inside of what you would see inside of SharePoint or Microsoft 365. You would actually have to take the code that you got on the left, and you would have to kind of create your own component on the right. Now, fortunately, Microsoft has something called, actually it used to be called Fabric UI, now it's called Fluent UI. But it's kind of Microsoft's design language for pretty much everything that is used within the Microsoft world. Even the Microsoft website uses elements that are consistent with the Fluent UI. I have the QR code here if you want to visit the Fluent UI website. But let's go take a look at what the Fluent UI looks like. So hopefully you can see this here, the Fluent UI website. This is the same URL that you would get on the QR code. If you go to, you'll see the Fluent UI has different versions of the controls that are available for you, whether you're building something for the web, Windows, or different platforms. You can even get cross-platform components. But each one of them will give you access to a whole bunch of controls. And these controls are designed to be consistent. So for example, you wanted to show a button, it'll give you guidance in terms of how to create this button, and then it'll show you the code for you to build a beautiful button inside of your app. Now, if we look at the example that I wanted to show information about someone, I know there's a control called persona control. And the persona control kind of gives me access to grabbing information about someone and then populating it like this so I can show. But if I look at the code for a second, you'll see that what I have to do is I have to go grab the information about this persona. I have to populate it, so including the initials, the name, secondary text, status, and things like that. And then I can call the persona control to actually populate this information. It's you can deal with that. It's okay. But you have to parse all the code. You have to go through all that stuff. And then the one thing that you don't get here is that fancy mouse over effect that you get in Office 365. I want to be able to mouse over someone's name, view more information, and things like that. So the Fluent UI is useful for building consistent applications, but it still doesn't give me exactly kind of that experience that I want. And again, remember, I'm the world's laziest developer. I don't want to have to write code to do this. Now, what if I want to do something even more complicated? Like, because the persona control is great. It will allow me to show someone's information, but I have to parse it myself. So what happens if I grab code? For example, this is one of the graph calls, and I know it looks very small. It's not intended to be legible. I kind of wanted it to look scary. You look at this code on the left. That is the result of calling the Graph API for someone's calendar. And then you want to convert this into something like this on the right, which shows a pretty agenda that looks consistent with the experience you would get in the Microsoft 365. How do you do that? Well, that's where the Microsoft Graph Toolkit comes to the rescue. So the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, there's a QR code here if you want to go visit the site. But the Microsoft Graph Toolkit is, again, a great collection of like web components and helpers that you can use. And again, I can't stress this enough. It pretty much works out of the box. Once you've authenticated or authorized, sorry, your application to access your graph data, the Graph Toolkit will help you render information in a nice and fun way. So let's go take a look at this. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on here. So this is the Microsoft Graph Toolkit website here, and there's tons of documentation. It's actually a pleasure to look at some Microsoft stuff that has great documentation that's usually up to date. But I'm not much of a reader for myself. What I like to do is I like to go into the code, and I like to explore stuff. So for example here, if I wanted to get the agenda that I was showing you, this is the result here, and this is the code that you'd have to write to actually get someone's agenda. Again, I'm oversimplifying because you still need to build the application, you still need to authorize the application to access the graph data, but this is what I'm going to be walking you through today. And then sometimes some controls have some JavaScript associated to it and some CSS, but we'll come back to that. And we will explore a little bit more of the Graph Toolkit very shortly. So, if you think about this, now I can take the Graph API call, the scary Graph API call that we were talking about before, and I can custom write the code myself, or I can use the Graph Toolkit to actually make the call for me and give me the same results. Since I'm the world's laziest developer, I bet you know which solution I would use. Now, why would you use the Microsoft Graph Toolkit? Well, the Microsoft Toolkit, first of all, the Graph Toolkit helps you cut development time, because there's a lot of the tweaking that you'd have to do, mapping the fields, kind of parsing the fields and doing all that stuff. It does that for you. It does the calls for you. It does the rendering for you. And it's been tested a lot more than I would personally test my own code. It also works everywhere. And when I say work everywhere, we're talking about regardless of the platform you're using, the development platform you're using. So you can use HTML, you can use React, Angular, Vue. It also works on pretty much any browser, right? So any of the browsers there, including some browsers I don't even know what the icons stand for. But the other thing that's important about the Graph Toolkit is it's actually beautiful and flexible, right? It's designed to look like Microsoft 365 experiences, but it's also completely customizable. You can customize using CSS custom properties to change kind of minor styles. I want this color or this font or this this style to be bolded. But you can also use templating. You can override the template that is used to render the code, and that's actually pretty cool. So let's get started. And we're going to start with building a very simple web-based app, and then soon thereafter we'll build a SharePoint app. Let's go back to the Microsoft Graph Toolkit for a second. I wanted to kind of explore this a little bit more before we go. So for example, this is someone's agenda, and if you look at the documentation here, they always tells you for each control, they will tell you what parameters or attributes you can pass. And there's also properties. So what's the difference between attributes and properties? The attributes are usually the things that you would be passing if you were just passing the information inside of HTML itself. The properties would be if you're accessing the control, the Graph Toolkit control through code. So you're using JavaScript or something like that behind the scene, and you want to pass information. This is how you do that. Because if you've ever tried to call a property in code that has dashes in it and things like that, it's often really painful. But you can actually do that using these names here. So don't get confused. The attributes are for HTML. So if I actually just put a date here, I would just put date, and then I'm too lazy to actually write a date here, so I'm not going to do that. But the other thing that you can do here is you have access to CSS, and so those are CSS custom attributes. So you're not changing the CSS directly of the components. You're saying, these are the elements inside the component, and I want to override these. So this is the event box shadow. I want to change the color and the size, the margin, the padding, all these things are there for you to customize. And then every control usually will give you samples, or what they call stories, right? So those are really common use cases that you would find. So for example, here, get by date. Remember, I was too lazy to put a date here, but get by date, it shows you how to do it. And this is a result. So if I change this code here, I'll get different results. If you want to get events for next week, you can do that. So let's just go back where we get to play with the canvas. Let's just copy that. Right. So here I'm getting events for the next week. Right. So if I set events for the next day, it should be a lot less. Right. So this is live. Now, again, just like the Graph Explorer, the Graph Toolkit, I'm still not Megan. So the Graph Toolkit playground actually connects to sample data. You can, if you want, log into your own environment and use your own data to play with this. But there are some components here, and there's quite a few, right? So the login component is the one that allows you to actually add a login button to your website. The people component is the one that allows you to show information about people. So you can actually say, show me people in a group, or show a custom query. So for example, here's people for this group, or here's the user IDs that I want to show, and it actually shows you the information here. You have other really cool controls like the people picker, which allows you to start typing, and you should be able to find stuff really quickly. And again, you can limit to groups and stuff like that. The person one is the one that I think we've already shown you a little bit, but it's the one that allows you to say, well, show me information about a person, or show me information about the current person that's logged in. And then you got some styles that you can do. So I want to show just a picture. I want to add a custom hover effect to this and have some stuff. Or I want to, instead of using a hover, I want to use click, right? So here, as long as I hover, it doesn't do anything. But if I click, it does stuff. So, and again, this is all done by using either attributes, or if you're using code behind the scene, you can use properties to make these calls. There's a lot more stuff that you can do. So the person card here is that thing that you saw when I mouse over someone. You can actually customize this. And this is one of my favorite thing to do, is to kind of add custom information. And we'll show you that in a second here. Some really cool stuff. And then I can show my tasks or someone's tasks again. So this is great if I had project. Hopefully I don't have any outstanding tasks here. But if you have some stuff here, you want to show how to connect to a channel, I can start typing a channel here. These are my teams, and these are my channels. So all these controls are built in for you, and you can leverage them. And then you can actually do some fancier samples. So for example, this is a sample that you saw before. I want to add a login button at the top, and then I want to show my agenda. Or let's just do something fun here. Let's actually show a person's card, and we're going to add, see, there's this new thing in here now that allows me to pass a template. And again, the documentation for each control will tell you what templating options are available. Is somewhere in there. So it shows you the templating options available. And the great thing about that is you can actually, if it tells you, well, here, for example, you can override the template for the person card inside of a person query. And in this case, inside the person card, I actually want to embed a custom template for the details where I'm going to add additional information. And so what you should see here is if I mouse over, I have my ability to add my favorite information here. So this is great. We're gonna come back to this very shortly. I'm gonna copy this. Let's actually go back to how to get started. So what I'm showing you today is actually, there's a great article by Elise Yang which shows you how to do what I'm about to do in greater detail. Yes?
Hugo, just before you continue, there are two questions on the Q&A list.
Yeah.
The first one is, if you're deploying an SPFX solution in a site collection app catalog and you use Microsoft Graph, does the app still need to be authorized at the tenant catalog, or is there somewhere in the site collection and you give the authorization?
So if you're using the Graph Toolkit inside of a, like say, a SharePoint Web part, you, instead of authorizing the app through, like say, Azure, you will use the API access functionality in the SharePoint admin, and I'll be showing that very shortly.
And the second question was if you could somehow increase the font size of the content you're sharing.
Oh yes, I will try to remember that when I move next.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. I always forget. I like to have my font very, very small, and I have a very large screen, so I apologize.
Okay.
Okay, so if there's no questions, I will continue. So the QR code for Elise, her blog is here, and this is a great article, but I'll save you the reading. I'll walk you through what we have to do. So the first thing you do is you go to Azure, and you go to your Azure Active Directory, and then under your Azure Active Directory, you go to App Registrations, and you create a new registration. That's the first thing, to create an app that allows you to access your graph information. This is not specific to the Graph Toolkit. This is just to access graph information. In this case, what I'll do is I'll say I want to allow any organization from any directory. And then here you would put the URL to your website. I'll be using localhost for my sample. And then I will click on register to register the app. Now, when we're doing this inside of a SharePoint app, you don't have to do any of that. You use a different method to do this. But if you're building something in a website, this is how you go. The magical thing here that you'll need is that client ID that's right here. That'll get produced. Now, sometimes the documentation will talk about the client ID. Sometimes they'll talk about the application ID. It gets confusing. So they're kind of the same, right? So that's why I'm happy that they changed the label here to see application and client ID. Once you have this, you kind of want to save this somewhere. You go to let's see. You go to your come on, your authentication, and then in your authentication, you say I want to allow access tokens and ID tokens. And again, Elise explained in greater details what we need to do here, but you just click save, and that's pretty much it. So now what it's going to do is it's going to give implicit grants enabled. So when people log in, they will be prompted to, depending on what items you have on your app, they'll be prompted to say, hey, this app is trying to access your contact information. Are you sure? Of course, we can always go in and explicitly grant these things, but let's show you how we do that in the code. And we'll try to zoom in here. So this is actually, if the audience can tell me if this is big enough. But the first thing that I'll do in the HTML is I will actually go in and attach the MGT loader JavaScript. This is pretty much all I need to do to be able to get connected to this. And then once you have this, because they're web components, they're actually just regular HTML tags that start with MGT. Again, you go to the documentation, and if you remember, we went to this site, we said I want the login and the agenda. So this is what we'll do here. We'll say login. Let's just put agenda here. Login and agenda. There you go. But the other thing that you do is remember that magic GUID that had the application ID and client ID. You embed that into something that's called your provider. Now, the Microsoft Graph Toolkit creates, or it provides a lot of providers for you that allows you to authenticate using different ways. There's actually the authentication library provider. There's and if you're using SharePoint, there's the SharePoint provider. There are other providers that you can use to authenticate to suit your solution. And you can actually use your own provider solutions as well, implement your own providers. But for this example, we're going to use just the plain MSAL provider. We're going to add a login button on the screen, and we're going to add an agenda. And just for gratuitous demo purposes, we're going to show the person's information here. And if I go to view the site, and if the demo gods are with me, what should happen here is it should say sign in. Now, you'll notice in my code, I didn't put if statements, if this is logged in, show this. The Graph Toolkit takes care of that stuff for me. The login, this here is the login control that I put here. When I click on this, if this was the first time, it would actually say, oh, and of course it's doing this because it's a demo. Let's do this quickly. If this was the first time I was doing this, it would actually ask me to authorize what I do here. But then what it's doing is it's actually getting the information. This is my agenda information. This is my profile information. And this is, this is what you saw in my code. Now, again, if I go back to the playground and I play a little bit with this, for example, let's go back to that templating sample. And the templating sample here, no, actually, let's just do this one. This one's easier. So if I grab this here and I put this in my code, I'm just going to remove this, and you'll see that this is live. This is usually where I make mistakes. So there, I've just copied this, and now we should have information about me with my favorite animal friends, hedgehogs. My favorite animal friends, and then I go back to my code here. Oops, this one here. What you should see is, again, it's changed the code, and when I mouse over, I have this thing with hedgehogs. So it's actually very simple and very straightforward to do this. Now, again, I went very quickly because I'm trying to show a lot of stuff in today's session, but let's continue. I want to walk you through a little bit the key elements of this. So the first thing that you saw in my code is I had the script, and that was the thing that made it possible for my web application to use the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Then I use my provider, whatever provider I chose to use, and my client ID. Then for a website, I want my website to allow me to log in, because this website, as you saw, was running on my local host. It was not logged in. It didn't have a context of who I am in Microsoft 365. So the login is what will do this. And then when the login, once you're successfully logged on, the login will actually tell the provider, hey, we're logged in, and the provider will tell the components and the page, yes, we're logged in, now we can start showing information. And so this is what your control would be, let's say, for showing information about someone. Everything else, the stuff at the top here that I added, the font and the URL at the bottom, was just because I don't like Times New Roman, and I wanted to be able to quickly click on the page to show the playground. That is totally, I could have removed all that stuff and have something that has about 10 lines of HTML. But now that we've done this, let's see how I would use this inside of the Microsoft Graph Toolkit inside of the SharePoint framework. So if the first code that I showed you was kind of a tricycle that's super easy, this is kind of a bit more advanced, but you'll see it's actually pretty straightforward. So if we go back to what I had to do for the website, right? This is the same code that I did for the website. So I had this thing here that allowed me to load the JavaScript for the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Well, when I'm using SharePoint framework, I usually don't want to link the individual JavaScript. You want to use npm packages. So for this one, you would just do npm install and then the @Microsoft Graph Toolkit or @Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Instead of putting the Microsoft MSAL provider here, what you would do is you would actually use the SharePoint provider, because when you're in a SharePoint framework, you could use either SharePoint or Teams, but when you're inside of a SharePoint framework solution, you're actually already authenticated. So we don't need to do the login, and we don't need to do all that stuff. And the client ID is not necessary either, because we will use the API management to do that. So that login button here, we don't need that. We're going to get rid of that. We're going to be already logged on when we're going to go in. And because SharePoint or Teams tries to avoid prompting you for additional information about whether you want to allow this, that's usually done by the person that adds the web parts into the solution, and the SharePoint administrator decides whether something has access to the APIs or not. So that's how we're going to manage this. So really, what consists of your code inside of your SharePoint web part or your SPFX solution is really this, which is your content, right? That's your web part content. The sample that I'm going to be showing today is actually in GitHub. This is actually a fantastic web part that Shanta Kumar Tambidurai created. The URL to the repo is here. Now this is my forked version of the repo because I made some changes to it, but all the credit goes to him. If the solution works, he did all the work. If it doesn't work, I was the one that broke it. But again, you have access to this. So how do you create your SharePoint web part? Well, if you've never done this, you go to your folder and you type yo @Microsoft and then SharePoint, or you can use the PnP team Yeoman generator, and then depending on how fast your network is, it may take some time here. But it asks you for the name, so we'll put MGT demo, we'll say we want SharePoint, and then we'll use the current folder. And then ask you, do you want to automatically deploy the solution? No, we don't want to automatically deploy the solution. But this is the key here. It's asking you, do you want to have access to to APIs? Yes, we will need access to APIs because we'll be authorizing to access the graph information. So we're building a web part. We're going to say this is the MGT editor, and let's just put a description there. Allow to edit. That should be good enough. And then I like React, but for this sample here, it's just going to start with no JavaScript framework. We'll do a React web part after if we have time. And then this is the part where, depending on how quickly your network works, you might be sitting here for a while. I happen to have 3 children that are all playing Fortnite while being on video calls and watching YouTube or Netflix at the same time. And my wife is on a video conference call as we're doing this. So for the sake of this, I sped up the video and I went back to, I showed you the success screen. But that's it. Your web part solution is created. Then you need to go in to your solution. And what we need to do is we need to add the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Again, so we use npm install. npm is the node package manager to do install. And then it, again, depending on how many children you have, this may or may not be fast. Once the install is done, you can actually go to the package.json to verify that you have the Microsoft Graph Toolkit in your solution. And we're almost done. What you need to do here is you need to add in your web part itself. And I like to do this in the actual web part. You know, if I use React, you can have a web part that calls a component that displays a code. I like to do this little bit in the web part itself. I go in and I import the providers and the SharePoint provider from the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. And then while you're there, you also need to do one little bit. Remember how in our HTML page we had the login button, and when we logged on, it automatically set the provider to the MSEL provider, and then the provider told the components on the page, yes, we're logged in, we're good, let's go. So this is the equivalent of this. What we're doing here in the initialize method of the web part, we say to the Microsoft Graph Toolkit global provider, this is the SharePoint provider, and use the context of this web part. That's really what we need to do for the Graph Toolkit to be aware of the context in the page. Now, obviously, I also need to authorize this, and this is the part that was different in the HTML. I had to go to Azure AD to authorize the thing. In a web part itself, in a SharePoint framework solution, you go to the package solution .json, and you put all the web APIs that you want to access. Now, because I wanted this demo to be really flexible, I went nuts a little bit here and I created a lot of permissions. I strongly recommend that you only set the permissions that you need for your solution. And then for the purpose of this demo, what I did is in my web part itself, I actually added just two properties on my web part. One is the HTML code, and one is the JavaScript code. And again, I'll show you, if we have extra time, I'll show you how I can actually go in to the web part itself, and I can actually embed the code in my web part. But this is so powerful. I can actually create dynamic web parts that I can edit on the fly. When you build your web part and you deploy it, the first thing that it'll do is it'll say, hey, do you really trust this web part that Hugo built? And here's all the API permissions that this web part is asking for. And you're going to need to go to the API management page to approve these permissions. And again, this is the laundry list of permissions that I enabled. But as long as you trust me, you can just click deploy. And then when you go to the SharePoint Admin Center, you go to the API access section. You may have never had the chance to play with that, but you go to the API access, and then you'll see that you have pending requests section. And that's actually connected to the web part that you want. Now, you want to make sure when you're looking at this, you want to make sure that it's actually the web part that you deployed. You want to make sure that the permissions it's asking for are the permissions you want to get, and you want to make sure that the request date is the right one. You don't want someone to sneak in here and ask for access that they shouldn't have access to. Well, once you verify that, you can click approve. Now, because this is Microsoft, you have to, it always has to ask you, are you sure you want to do what you're trying to do? So you say, yeah, I want to approve this, click on approve. And that's it. That's once you've built your web part, you deployed it, and you authorize it, you can go to demo the web part. So let's go here, and this is the web part, and we're doing great on time. We're almost done here. So this is my web part, I believe. Let's see here. Yeah. And so I go to my MGT demo web part that I just built. And it starts with doing nothing. I didn't want to make the web part overcomplicated here. And this is actually the sample that we have, but see these two properties that we had defined with the HTML and the JavaScript. I can actually still go to this thing that I had, and I'll copy this here from the Graph Toolkit. I'll go in here, and hopefully this will work for me today. What should happen is, yeah, it automatically pick the information for me and show this. And again, you'll see here that my favorite animals are lions and rabbits and giraffes. Oh my. I can go a little bit more advanced. So if we go to the agenda here that uses templating, see this is a really fancy agenda here. I can grab all this code here, put it inside my web part, and there's an additional tab here. They're using some JavaScript here to update the thing in the sample. So who am I to argue with them? Let's just copy this JavaScript right here. And then you see it doesn't look pretty. That's because in the sample, they're using some CSS. So I'm going to copy the CSS here. And I know I'm going quickly. I want to make sure I have enough time for questions. But I just go here, embedded style object, and click save, and there you go. And this is actually my real, well, it's not my real agenda. It's sample data that I put in, but it's actually coming from my tenant. Now, I could have actually absolutely gone in to the code itself and embedded this code, but I wanted to be able to in this demo, I wanted to be able to be flexible enough to make changes in front of you. So I just embedded the HTML. But that's really the power of the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, is because they're web components, I can do it in HTML, I can do it in a string inside of HTML, or I can actually go into my code itself in my web part render method, and I can embed the Graph Toolkit as well. All right, so just to make sure I have enough time to wrap up here, I'm gonna finish with the slides, and then if we have questions or you want more demos, we can play a little bit. So, as you saw today, the Microsoft Graph Toolkit makes it really insanely easy for you to take the data out of the Microsoft Graph and connect to the data and then display it in a way that looks out of the box. As you saw with the templating options and the style options, we're able to actually change the look and feel of things to actually suit our needs. And in our demo, we didn't do any, JavaScript if statements or anything like that, but you could absolutely, go into your code and add your own components here, either using Fabric UI to make sure that you're adding buttons and checkboxes and things like that look like they belong to SharePoint or Microsoft 365, and then to get to the data that you need. Again, the sample that I've provided is available for you online, but I want to make sure that I'm finishing in time. So if you have any questions, I can be reached on my blog at tahoeninjas.blog, where I usually blog the exact same stuff that you saw here today. We'll actually be posting kind of a guest blog on the Microsoft blog as well that shows kind of a longer version of this demo very shortly. Again, I'm always happy to reach out or to talk to you on Twitter. I'm available at BernieH, and this is the QR code for my blog. Everyone, please consider donating to some of the charities here and again, 10% of the funds from our sponsors are going to support community relief. I would love it if you could actually give us some feedback I tried to make this session as action-packed as possible while making it manageable within 50 minutes. Please give me some feedback. Don't be shy. I won't be offended. I might cry myself to sleep, but I will get over it, and I will become better if you give me some feedback. The event also, we would love to find out how this is doing. Is this something we should repeat? I certainly would love to be invited again. With that, that's it for me. If there's any questions, I'll switch to the Q&A panel.